Hey everyone, it's been over 2 minutes and I haven't even had a threat of rape yet. Hi, I'm Diana Davison, a Canadian men's rights activist. We're going to talk today about a case called R versus Lavallee. This is a Canadian precedent-setting case in which a woman used the battered woman syndrome as her defense for killing a man. Let's start this out with a discussion of Justice Bertha Wilson. In 1990, Wilson gave a speech called "Will Women Judges Really Make a Difference?" At the time of her speech, Wilson was busy writing the decision for R versus Lavallee. So first, let's meet the cast of characters. We have Angelique Lynn Lavallee and Kevin Rust, also known as Rooster. Lynn and Kevin were essentially the power couple in a biker gang. They hosted parties, he was known to be quite violent, she was also a little bit of a scrapper herself, and together they were pretty much the alpha couple of the group. On the night in question of the incidents, they'd been out at a bar drinking. They decided to move the party back to their house. And when they got back there, pulled out what was called a beer ball, put it in the backyard, and it was quite a loud and obnoxious party, which neighbors phoned and complained about to the police. As they got drunker and drunker, various things happened. Kevin went out to get more ice. He forgot to get the ice. He yelled at her, made her go out and get ice. So we've got drunk people who are out driving around on motorcycles and amazingly made it back safe. And the party continued until about 1 a.m. As they got drunker, Kevin Rust became more obnoxious, as he was wont to do when he got drunk. And Lavallee and Rust were known to fight quite often. So this is a little bit of the lead up to the story, but let's just look at the events of the evening. There were some verbal spats going on between Lynn and Kevin. At one point, Kevin became drunk enough that he vomited in the basement and passed out. Lynn cleaned up the vomit and then went back outside to become the main host of the party. Her first act on doing so was to evict Kevin's sister, Wendy, who she had a problem with because, well, I might as well go into the details. Apparently Wendy didn't say hi to her on the bus and didn't acknowledge her when she was on the bus, and this disturbed Lynn. So when Kevin was passed out, she went outside and took control of the party and said, get you and your friends out of here, because she had 3 people they didn't really know who were there drinking Lynn's beer. And she took a swing at Wendy. Wendy decided that instead of just leaving, she was going to go downstairs, wake up Kevin, and get him to deal with the situation. So Kevin stumbles outside and just like, what's going on? He ended up grabbing Lynn because she was trying to attack Wendy in this spat that was taking place. So you can see here already that Lynn is an aggressor. She's an aggravating person in this conflict going on. And it wasn't just something she was doing in response to Rust being awake and threatening her or something like that. She was basically just being an obnoxious cunt in her own way. And, Kevin was an obnoxious asshole as well. But this is how the events started to take place, where they escalated. So he grabbed her arm to keep her from attacking Wendy. She ended up running around the yard a little bit and then hiding behind one of the male guests, at which point afterwards she went inside, locked the door, said, "Oh my God, he's going to beat me." And one of her friends there, because she did have friends, she had a number of friends, they were the power couple, a popular couple, both of them were, said, "Well, it wouldn't be like that if you were with me." I find that's a little bit relevant because of, the later case that's going to be presented, where they're saying that she had no options and she had no, she was isolated as a battered woman. So the guy goes out to try and calm Kevin down, and then he leaves the door unlocked and such. Lynn takes off upstairs, up to the 2nd floor. So at this point, Lynn runs upstairs to the 2nd floor. She's stomping around, carrying on, and she was heard yelling stuff like, "Fuck this shit." And in the meantime, Kevin and 3 of the guests, 2 of the guests that we already knew were going to stay overnight, they knew were going to stay overnight, it was planned. But one of them was passed out on the couch of the 2 who were supposed to be staying, and we had some extra people. So of the ones who were conscious, Kevin and 3 of his friends moved the sound system in from outside to the basement, while listening to Lynn upstairs stomping around and carrying on. She's like, oh yeah, she's really pissed off. And it was like, somebody should go up and talk to her. It's like, well, nobody wanted to go up there. And then they heard a gunshot. And some more stomping around and some crying and shit going on. So Kevin goes, okay, well, I'm going to go up there. And like, yeah, he didn't follow their advice. They're like, I don't think you should go up there, dude. And he goes upstairs, and it seems to be by evidence that he hauled her out of the closet, slapped her around a few times, and then came back downstairs and said to the other female who was present, I think you ought to go up there and talk to her. She's really pissed off. She's really upset. You need to calm her down. And she's like, the woman goes, I don't want to go anywhere near it. So he went back upstairs, and a few minutes later, there was a second gunshot, which was the back of Kevin Rust's head being blown off as he tried to leave the room. There were some words said from the time he went back into the room and the time his head got blown off. We don't know exactly what those were, because Lynn can tell us what those were. The other witness is now dead. And so here is the history of Lynn Lavallee and Kevin Rust. There were hospital records that showed Lynn had been admitted with injuries consistent to having been hit by Kevin Rust. She gave other excuses for it, but there's no reason to think that those were true. They are very consistent with her having been hit by Kevin Rust. There is also evidence given that Lynn was quite aggressive. In fact, one of the stories told about her violence and actual serious physical assaults against Kevin Rust involved him and a friend coming into the house with a couch they were moving. He yelled at her to come help them out, and she came down the stairs with a baseball bat, with which she hit him in the arm. There were some words said between the two of them. She went back upstairs, got a gun, pointed it at his head, and said, don't ever fucking touch me. There was another time where there was an argument that broke out over some photographs of some sort that were on the wall. Lynn went upstairs, grabbed a gun, came back downstairs, held it to his head, and said, don't talk to me that way, or don't touch me, or whatever it was, or I'll kill you. So this is a woman who very clearly had boundaries. Battered women don't set boundaries. Battered women can't set boundaries. Lynn Lavallee has been seen assaulting Kevin Rust. Kevin has been seen throwing Lynn over a couch, throwing her across the room. Both were violent mutually. So we don't know with these hospital records whether or not she was in the hospital after she started something. Did she come down the stairs and hit Kevin with a bat, and then he threw her across the room and she broke her arm? We don't know exactly how these injuries happened. Well, the only thing we actually know is that Lynn had actually initiated extreme physical violence against Kevin Rust. And we do know from the testimony of his friend that Kevin Rust dealt with things by being violent. So if he had a problem, he would deal with it through violence. Neither one of them was likely very intelligent. We don't really know their IQs, but we do know what their lifestyle was, and this was a chosen lifestyle. On the night of the murder, Lynn claims that Kevin said he would get her later. According to testimony, every time Kevin said he would get her later, Lynn responded by setting a clear boundary. She went upstairs, got a gun, and returned to point it at his head, stating that he wasn't to ever touch her again. You would think at this point that Angelique Lynn Lavallee would be on trial for murder. Not the case. R versus Lavallee was the trial of a dead man, Kevin Rust, and whether or not he was guilty of battering his girlfriend. The charges thus. On August 30th, 1986, Kevin Rust did abuse his girlfriend to the point she was justified in killing him. How do you plead, Mr. Rust? Dead? All right, let's proceed. The evidence against you, Mr. Rust, is that, being dead, you must have beaten her badly enough for her to kill you. Do you have any evidence that this is untrue? Oh, still dead, I see. I'll take that as a no.
In all my years of judging, I have never seen before someone more deserving of full penalty of law.
Aye, there's the rub. The full penalty of law is not death. You only get the death penalty in Canada now if a woman kills instead of calling the police or choosing other action. This case is a precedent that allows women to get away with vigilante so-called justice if they can produce one iota of evidence that the guy hit them at some point prior to the killing. After shooting part of Kevin's head off, Lynn screamed, "He hit me in the fucking face! He hit me in the face!" It could bring to doubt whether or not this was a usual event. At the police station, Lynn gave a long, rambling statement, which her lawyer didn't object to having submitted. In it, she claims to love Kevin. She says she hopes he's not dead, that he beat her up a lot, and there were hospital records that they should look into. She also asked if anyone had locked the door to her house, and mentioned that she thought she was too young to go to jail. All very sympathetic. Upon hearing that Kevin was dead, she cried and asked if she would be allowed to go to the funeral. She also asked, "What about the money he owed me? And will I still get his motorcycle?" Keep this in mind, because there are alternatives to why Lynn Lavallee kept going back into this relationship, namely status, and she really liked his motorcycle. She also asked how other prisoners were going to treat her when she got to jail, presumably because she knew she was guilty of shooting somebody to death. There are now 3 parts to this trial. Lynn pled not guilty to manslaughter or second-degree murder. Her lawyer presented the case as self-defense based on the battered woman syndrome. The original trial acquitted her after hearing testimony from Dr. Fred Shane, which asserted that Lynn fit the battered wife syndrome and therefore did not have the option of leaving the home. The only option she had left was to fight for her life. The Crown appealed the decision, stating that Dr. Shane's testimony should not have been allowed because it was based on interviews with Lynn, and Lynn did not testify in her own trial. This is important, so I'll explain it a little bit better. Because Lynn didn't testify, meaning she couldn't be cross-examined, the evidence on which Dr. Shane based his diagnosis of battered woman syndrome should not have been admissible because it was hearsay. He was basing his diagnosis on testimony that was not admissible into court. It hadn't been admitted into the trial, and it couldn't be questioned. Things like, when you went to the hospital, was that after you hit him with a bat, or was that because he just spontaneously started beating you, or a typical battered wife scenario? Because she couldn't be cross-examined, all of the testimony that Dr. Shane listened to from her, and from her mother, who also didn't testify, was not admissible into court. And the only thing that Dr. Shane could talk about was what a battered wife was and what that might mean, because battered wife syndrome was not actually in the DSM. It's not actually an official syndrome. He could explain what they think it means, and then the jury would have to decide if she fit that themselves. For Dr. Shane to say that she was a battered wife meant that they had to rely on testimony that was not cross-examined, that wasn't verified to be true. But in instruction to the jury was just amounted to semantics, and that it was a huge public expense to go back to trial again, and that he didn't think that mere semantics justified the public expense. Because there was this one dissent, that allowed Lavallee's lawyer to appeal the appeal. So when it went to the Supreme Court, which is the precedent-setting decision, this was a second appeal. We had an acquittal, and then we had an appeal which succeeded and said it should go back to trial because Dr. Shane's testimony should either have not been allowed, or it should have been better instructed to the jury as to the minimal amount of weight that should have been given to it. And then we have now a Supreme Court appeal saying that the original instructions were just fine. Were they, or were they not? Now, appeal courts do not retry cases. This is commonly misunderstood. An appeal court only looks at points of the law. They decide whether or not the law was applied properly in a case. And if it wasn't, then it goes back to a new trial. So, in the Supreme Court decision given by Justice Bertha Wilson, the matter before the court was solely to decide whether or not the instructions to the jury and the admission of Dr. Shane's testimony was an error of law. In the decision given and written by Bertha Wilson. It referenced non-legal literature such as books by Lenore Walker and other feminists seeking to show that battered women syndrome is a real thing. As stated earlier, the DSM still does not list battered women syndrome as a real thing. Bertha decided that Lynn was in fact a battered woman suffering from a syndrome that, as such, Dr. Shane's testimony was required to give her a fair trial. That, my friends, is a classic example of the fallacy begging the question. She decided that his testimony was legitimate because she was battered, where the actual question was, can we determine that she was a battered woman based on this testimony? Was the testimony legally submitted? That's begging the question. Her response, her decision, was basically in defiance of the original question. It took it back to the original question. Was she battered? The other mistake that Bertha makes in her decision is the claim that centuries ago it was law that a man could beat his wife as long as the switch wasn't thicker than his thumb. That myth has been long debunked, and as a Supreme Court justice, Bertha should have known not to make judgments based on urban legends. Concerning errors, Elizabeth Sheehy in Chapter 1, which is the chapter we're dealing with, the case of Angelique Lynn Lavallee, asserts that the Lavallee decision was a monumental one for criminal law, both in Canada and in other common law countries. The only woman on the Supreme Court had managed to unify it and produce a decision telling Canadians that women are entitled to use self-defensive violence, preemptive violence even, when protecting themselves against battering husbands. The Supreme Court judges who decided that case included Justice Claire Leheureux-Dubé and Justice Beverly McLaughlin. That means there were 3 women on that court who made the decision, not one. As far as Dr. Shane is concerned, a Winnipeg female judge, Laurie Douglas, said, "I have read Dr. Shane's reports many a time, including this time and on another occasion with exactly the same diagnosis, with about as much evidence." Douglas has since stepped down as a judge because explicit photos of her engaging in kinky SM-style sex were found online. Perhaps her understanding of complex sexuality allowed her to understand human behavior a little bit better than Bertha. Never let anyone say that the courts are boring. As to any psychiatrist offering testimony about battered wife syndrome, I'm going to link to a study below that shows that psychiatrists will say a person is or is not battered depending on who's paying them. And now for the rape joke of the week, thanks to Chevington X Bear. Man walks into the local pharmacy and says, "I'm here to pick up some condoms for my daughter." Shocked, the pharmacist says, "You're telling me your 14-year-old is sexually active?" The father shrugs, says, "Active? Not really. She just lays there like her mother."